Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marilyn Shannon, and I welcome you today to the Breaking Free Show. And I'm delighted to have you here. And I hope all of you had a wonderful holiday wherever you are. I know friends of mine in Italy celebrated Thanksgiving, so it's becoming the real thing. And I have to say that I am thankful for Thanksgiving. Just a wonderful time just to kind of regroup and remember and just who you are and who you're with. So thank you for being here. It's an honor. Before we get started with the show, I want to say hi to Annan.
Hello, Marilyn. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm just.
And how was your day?
The day's been great, even though it's kind of like gloomy outside.
It's a little gloomy.
It's fine. It's about
Yeah.
time for winter.
But I didn't even look at the gloom. I just looked at the fact I was coming here to the
Did you-
studio to do
yeah.
a show. I don't even see no gloom. It wasn't dark where I came from. It was light. So anyway, on with our show. So if you've watched us before, we bring the greatest people doing some of the most interesting things, and we find people all over the place, and we are really delighted by today's show. So let me just tell you before we get started, you are more than welcome to partake in today's show. This is a community, so please feel free anytime you want to call in at 919-518-9773, or you can connect with us on Skype at computers, that's plural, 2, that's the number 2, K-Voice. If you'd like to call in, comment, ask questions. And we also have a live chat. You can put your name right near the video, nickname, and real name, and ask questions and communicate with us there. So I want to introduce you to my guest today, Beth Macy. She is a New York Times best-selling author, and she has written this book called Truevine, which is very interesting. And when you hear about it, you're going to say, you know what? I think I remember something about this story. And you're going to hear firsthand about this amazing account and what she did and how she created it. So let me welcome Beth to our show. Hey, Beth.
Hey, Marilyn. So happy to be here.
It's lovely to have you. I'm so happy that you've come, because when I was looking at your bio and I saw Beth Macy writes about outsiders and underdogs, already I'm like in love with this woman, because she's giving a voice to people who may never have had a voice before, may never have been seen before. So I'm delighted that you're here. So tell us about Beth.
Oh, that's a nice way to put it. I appreciate that. Well, I do write about outsiders and underdogs, and I probably do those stories best because I am one.
Okay, Beth, hold on just a second.
Beth, that noise started coming this way now.
Oh gosh, the barreling down of the truck.
Yes, it's only when
Golly.
you're talking. That's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Go ahead and reconnect, just for the sake.
Okay. How about I get off and then you guys call me for
That's
something
fine.
different.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay, you do that.
All right, everybody, hold tight. We're coming back. And what a place that she left us, right? With being an underdog herself. So hold on. We're going to hear what she has to say.
Hello.
Okay, that's much better.
Okay.
All
I
right.
can still hear it a bit on my end, but it's not terrible.
Okay, good.
Oh, wait,
so,
actually, don't hear it.
okay, so you were saying that
Oh, I do hear it a little.
So you're saying that you were an underdog yourself.
Well, yeah, I was from a poor family in a small town in Ohio, and I was the first in my family to go to college. And I credit that going to college with really allowing me to be upwardly mobile and to join the middle class. And it just going to college and meeting my husband were kind of the two best things of my life, and then having our children. But that ability to move up in life, I realized that's gotten harder and harder to happen for some people, for many people, as society's gotten more unequal. And so those are the kinds of stories that I like to tell, that I feel a calling to tell, and those are the kind of stories that I put my heart into more, and I write them better than other kinds of stories. So once I realized that was like the key to my my special sauce, then that's kind of the stories that I set out to do.
So before we get into Truevine, you are the best-selling author of Factory Man, which is going to be a documentary series. Is that correct?
It has been optioned to be a mini series on HBO. So not a documentary, but like
Okay.
a creative project
Okay. And that
based on
based on
the book Factory Man.
okay. All right. So now take us to Truevine.
Sure. So Truevine, like Factory Man, grew out of a story that I did at the Roanoke Times. I live in Roanoke, Virginia, and I moved to Roanoke. Originally from Ohio, but I moved to Roanoke in 1989. I was a young feature reporter for the Roanoke Times newspaper. And it's a city of about 250,000. It's a small city, and it's like many cities in the South, it's kind of still segregated largely by neighborhood and income. And I was driving around with a photographer one day working on another story, and this was a guy who had grown up in Roanoke, and he tells me this incredible story about these two brothers, George and Willie Muse, who were kidnapped around 1900 and sold to the circus. They had they were albino African American brothers, and so they were. The story went that they were kidnapped by a circus bounty hunter, and then uh, forced to be exhibited as sideshow exhibits for a number of years. And that was the story he told me. And he said, this is kind of the quote I remember. He said, "It's the best story in town, but no one's been able to get it."
Mm-hmm.
And that just kind of, no one's been able to get it. And why hasn't anyone been able to get it? And the reason was one of the brothers was still remarkably alive. He lived to be 108. And he was still living when I first landed in Roanoke, and he was being cared for by his great niece, Nancy Saunders. And the reason nobody had been able to get the story, although many people had asked, was because the brothers had been exploited their whole lives, and she really wanted to protect them from additional exposure. She said, "They're resting. I want to give them a nice retirement." And so George Muse had passed away in 1972, but Willie didn't die until 2001. And she never did let me actually meet him. But she eventually let me do a story for the Roanoke Times after he passed away about their incredible careers and really about the incredible hero that their mother was.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I want to ask you. So when I read about this book and read in the book, so you said that the photographer had said sold. So what happened between being sold and kidnapping?
Well, sort of the same thing. I mean, it was very much the lore, especially in the Black community in Roanoke, that they had been kidnapped and then sold from one carnival to a bigger carnival to a smaller circus to a bigger circus, and finally in 1927 they're with Ringling Brothers. So there is two different origin stories. There is some evidence that suggests that their mother may have initially let them go, but that same evidence suggests that she expected them to be brought back, and they were not. So they were without their mother for a period of 13 years. They always said that they were kidnapped. They never believed that she had sold them. And so there is this kind of uncomfortable origin story of how they got with the circus that I deal with in the book.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you actually get the story? How did they find themselves okay with you?
The family, you mean?
Yes, the family.
Well, like I said, they waited until Uncle Willie passed away in 2001 before she let me write a newspaper series. And then after that, I didn't really think I'd be writing books. I thought I would, my plan was just to be a newspaper reporter for my whole life. And after I wrote Factory Man, which was published in 2014, I had finished it in 2013. And then I was thinking, well, I really want to write another book. So I called her and I asked her permission to write it as a book. And this was like November 11th, 2013. And I wrote it down on my calendar because she's kind of notoriously keeping you at a distance. So I wanted to see how long it took her to get back with me, because she said, "Don't call me back. I'm going to think about it and talk to my relatives, and I'll get back to you." So Thanksgiving came, early December. I sent her a Christmas card, because by now I've known her for a long time, and we're like friends, and she's a source, and she's helped me with other stories. And then finally, on the Christmas card, I wrote, "P.S. My phone number is," in case you lost it. And then finally on Christmas morning, she called that year and said that she would let me do the book but on one condition. And I said, what's that? And she said, no matter what you learn, and she knew I would find out some difficult, uncomfortable things, just remember, in the end, the brothers came out on top.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of interesting because those words sort of echoed with me as I would find out new things. And of course, in the end, they did come out on top because of the actions of their mother and their other family members that took such good care of them. Um, but there was some pretty tough stuff to uncover.
Mm-hmm. Beth, we're having that sound again, so I think we have to hang up and try you again.
Oh, so sorry.
Yeah, that's so.
okay,
Everybody,
that's
bear
all right.
with us. I mean, this is a little what you go through sometimes, a little technology, but we want to get the story, and just and she's in a hotel, and sometimes this is what happens when you are doing this kind of work. You can be
Okay.
anywhere. Well, let's give it a
Keep going,
try.
keep
So
going.
go ahead. So being on top is and maintaining the integrity of the story.
Right. And being respectful to the family, and really, to me, that meant telling the story with truth and dignity, and presenting the story in its full context. One of the things I wrestle with constantly is there were so many holes because the brothers were widely covered in the media because they were quite famous. The New York Times wrote about them, the New Yorker wrote about them, newspapers across the world wrote about them, especially when their mother got them back in 1927, because she then filed a lawsuit against Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey, and that was quite big news as well. But they were never written about from their point of view. So, which was not uncommon in that day. African Americans were widely considered, quote, subhuman beings. I mean, they were denied the vote. Uh, they were told where they could live, where they could work. They were paid less than white counterparts in many of the jobs that they had. And so this was a big area where I think it's almost a book as much about historic erasure as it is about what actually happened to these two interesting people.
So, considering the fact that there were so many sources out there that had been writing bits and pieces about the brothers, from what angle were you coming from?
I was coming from the angle of just trying to tell it truthfully, and like, so why wasn't their story ever told from their point of view? I mean, when I came up in journalism in the 80s and 90s, like, you had to give both sides of a story. But so, and how incredibly brave was it when she went into the sideshow tent in 1927 and demanded to have her children back? That was incredibly brave once I figured out that the top law enforcement official in Roanoke, Virginia in 1927 was also the founder of the local KKK. So it was all about putting that story into context for me. And so writing about the way the news media covered African Americans in general in Roanoke, and the way they covered the family in particular. So you notice that there's I mean, I go all over the world with the brothers as I'm kind of tracking down where they performed, but I'm concentrating more on kind of race relations in the South, in the city that I live in, and also in Truevine, which was this rural area where the family was initially from, and where most of the black people worked in sharecropping in tobacco fields for many, many years.
And that's what their mother did, right? She was a sharecropper.
Yeah, she was a sharecropper. Now, if you go to Truevine today and you talk to the old folks, and they all grew up hearing the story, and it was told as a cautionary tale. People would say, "Well, don't go out to the fair or the festival, or if you do, stay with your brother, or y'all might get kidnapped, like George and Willie." But they would all have a slightly different version of the story. Like, I met an older woman in Truevine who remembered her parents talking about it, and according to her, the brothers were kidnapped from outside the Truevine church. According to another community member, they were kidnapped from a festival, a traveling carnival that was coming through Truevine. Other people say they were kidnapped from nearby Rocky Mount. And if you talk to anybody in Roanoke, they would have grown up hearing that they were taken from a fair or festival or carnival in Roanoke. So there's lots of different stories. And of course, the circus people had their own stories about where they'd found them, which were just kind of crazy. They were said to be found floating on a piece of driftwood off the coast of Madagascar, and they would give them these crazy names like Iko and Iko, the Ecuadorian savages, and Iko and Iko, the ambassadors from Mars, and that was when they were said to be found coming out of a spaceship in the Mojave Desert. So that was kind of the way the sideshow worked. These kind of ordinary people from middle America would be given these, they called it a Zulu ticket. They would be made to be African savages, or given an exotic backstory in hopes of getting more admissions into the sideshow tent.
You know, it's so interesting because haven't thought about this in years. But growing up in New York, we always went to the circus. And I can remember, even as a little girl, somehow knowing that there was something about sideshows, and it could be the tallest man in the world, or the fattest lady in the world, or the lady with a beard, or, I mean, we grew up. That's what the circus meant.
Right. And Coney Island had a sideshow. Actually, the brothers performed on the off season at Coney Island. There's a picture of them in the sideshow at Coney Island in the book.
So this woman, their mother, Harriet, is that her name?
Harriet Muse, yes.
Harriet. So where did she come from? How did she? I mean, how did she? And you know, it's interesting because on the way over here to the studio today, I was listening to a story about Maya Angelou, and I couldn't listen to the whole thing. But they also were talking about how she'd been raped, and she was quite something back in her day in the Jim Crow era, and she was also in that time period. So where did this woman come from?
Right. So she came from rural Virginia. Her parents had been slaves. She was born in the 1870s. Don't know exactly when, because the records were so spottily kept for black families. I mean, and that's true up through like the 30s and 40s even. Their names were often misspelled in the census records. She never learned to read. She signed her name with an X. And she moved from Truevine, which is out in the middle of nowhere. Booker T. Washington also lived there for a time and said it was close to nowhere as one could be in the world. Very rural foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She moves to Roanoke, Virginia, about an hour away, and which is a booming city in the 19-teens. And she gets work as a domestic worker, and she works in people's homes, and she brings laundry home to her house. And she lives in this 517 square foot little shanty with no running water, with her other 3 children and her kind of not that great husband. And she doesn't read, as I say, so we don't even really know how it came to her that her brothers were going to be, or her sons, George and Willie, were going to be coming through Roanoke with the circus. She told family members that it came to her in a dream, and that's a story that the family has told for 5 generations now.
And so how did you, with all of the little information, it's a little different, it's not, this one had this folklore, this one had this one, how did you decipher what you wanted to write about?
Well, I just tried to get as close to the truth as I could, and I think it's interesting that there are different stories, and so I would just tell the reader that. I mean, I didn't hold anything back from the reader. There's nothing I learned that isn't in this book. I just felt it was important to give the full context so that the reader could make the choices about which story they wanted to believe. And, early in the early years when they were on the road, they told their relatives later that they were told that their mother was dead and that they should quit crying, they should quit asking for her. And that just must have been a really sad time. But the brothers, who were also denied the ability to go to school, they also never learned to read or write. So there was no treasured trove of letters that I was going to find in an attic, right? Like my friend Hampton Sides writes these great adventure books, these great stories, and these war heroes and these adventure stories. And he's always finding a trove of letters in the attic. That was not happening here because most of my characters were illiterate. So when I couldn't find out, like I would have like say, what was their life like in 1914 to 1917, I could find out what carnivals they were with, and I could find out about the people they were with, but I couldn't really find out what they were thinking at the time or what they were feeling at the time beyond what they had told family members, which was that it was a really, really hard time. And the older brother, George, who was 3 years older, they were teenagers then, would have to comfort Willie and say, I'm sure our mother's not dead. I'm sure we'll see her again. And during those early, really sad times, they would sing to each other at night. And there was a popular song called "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," which was a World War I anthem about missing home. And they would sing that song to each other at night when they would be really sad and homesick. And when they would see a rainbow in the sky, they would remember their mother telling them from the Bible that the rainbow is God's promise after a storm. And so, I could piece these moments together with the record that is factual, let the reader know, I try to let the reader know where the information is coming from. And then also, if there would be a similar story happening at the same time, I would digress and tell the story of, say, there was another person who was exhibited, and he literally was kidnapped from the Congo. His name was Otabenga, and he was actually exhibited in the Bronx Zoo in the early 1900s in a cage with an orangutan. And we know more of his story because it was well documented, and it raised the ire of black ministers in New York, and they actually got him out. And he landed in Lynchburg, Virginia, which was just an hour away from Roanoke. And so I posit that may have been a story that Harriet Muse had also heard, and maybe it gave her hope for her sons as well. But then that digression sort of allows me to say that, this wasn't the only family that this was happening to. This happened to lots of people, and lots of people were really exploited and treated like this. And here's some more information about to sort of help you judge what the real story is. There's no way to really know exactly what happened in that tobacco field in 1900. There's no way to recreate it. I can just get as close to it as I can get.
I mean, some way, some shape or form, they had to know about the brothers, right? They didn't just happen upon them. I mean, the circus, right?
Oh, yeah. And so I talk about, what they were called freak hunters, and maybe it's possible that they heard. I mean, albinos were kind of unusual. African American albinos a little more common than white people with albinism, but there were people out looking for people that they could display and exploit, and it was a big thing then, that you have to that was a tough thing, kind of putting your head back in that time period where circus was the number one form of entertainment in America between 1840 and 1940. It was the biggest thing going. So it was before radio, TV, films, professional sports. And it was before people had a lot of money and could go on vacations and things. The average family didn't go on a vacation then, but they would save their pennies for when the circus came to town, and that would be like their little vacation. And the sideshow was really just another way to get an extra admission fee out of a patron.
Just goes to show you what did appeal to people in that sideshow. I mean, because people paid to see these people in captivity.
Right.
So to speak.
And I don't even think questioned it. I mean, we're like, are they getting paid? Like, people didn't even think about that. It was also kind of spun by the circus folks, the sideshow folks, as scientific curiosity. Like, come see the albinos, and you'll almost like it's a learning experience. And, science, the study of science was still kind of brand new. I forget, I say in the book what year the word scientist was coined. It was like in the mid to late 1800s. Darwin, it was, I think, 1859. The study of creatures and of people, all that was kind of new, and the sideshow sort of fits into that contextually.
Yeah, I mean, it was the movies. We saw it in the movies. That's how I learned about it,
Yeah. Did you see the movie Freaks when you were?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I can remember these, I don't remember them vividly, but I can remember the experience, the feeling that I still hold in my heart when you think of it, the circus. I mean, when you think of even the word circus, there's a connotation applied to it that is about the sideshow.
Yeah, and a kind of like dangerous or slightly
Yes.
naughty or dirty or something.
Yes.
I don't know. I really struggled initially, like just looking at all those pictures, of the different sideshow acts. And then I felt guilty for feeling bad about looking at them. But,
Mm.
like anything, then I got used to looking at them and it didn't bother me anymore. But my son, who's 22 now, was 20 or 21 at the time, said, "You should watch American Horror Story," because they were doing a whole season on the sideshow. And I found that totally disturbing. I could not watch that.
Yeah, I can understand that. When I looked at some with your pictures in your book, and I
Hmm.
have to say, I'm going to hold it up, and you have it too, but I'm going to hold it up. And can everybody can it be which way? That good? Fabulous. And the pictures in the book
The other way.
this way.
Okay.
Okay. And the pictures in the book, I mean, you just have to see them, and
Yeah.
just the way Beth writes. I mean,
Aw,
it's,
thank you.
yeah. I mean, it's just, it's really amazing. I mean, it's
I had an expert, a sideshow expert, tell me, like a historian, tell me early on. He said, if you're looking for information about them, you should really look at the photographs more than anything else, because the circus employed these pitchmen to always spin the stories. That's why you have the Madagascar and the ambassadors from Mars and all that. You can never count that they would be called by the same names from one season to the next, because often they would change their names to give patrons the idea that it's going to be a whole new act than what you saw last year when the circus or the carnival came through. So, but a picture you can't really change. You can't. Picture doesn't lie. And so when I would get a picture, I'll hold up the
yeah.
very first picture I got. So when I found the very first picture of them, it was really eye-opening. And it was from, I think, 1914. It came from the John and Mabel Ringling Museum in Florida. And so, let me see. There they are. So they're children, clearly.
Mm.
And to me, they look scared. To me, they look like 12 and 15. Willie's shorter than George, and once they were of adult age, they were the same height. So they're still growing in this picture. And I just thought they looked scared, and that was a sad picture. But then I sent it to a theater history expert at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and he blew it up, and he saw all these things that I had noticed about it, namely that he could look at the costume, the suits, and tell that they were 2 sizes too small, and that they had been wearing them for a long time. They were supposed to look nice, but they weren't really being that well taken care of. And I wouldn't have noticed that. I just thought it was a different style or whatever. So whenever I would get a piece of information, like a photograph, I would send it to him, or there's another picture of them holding instruments in the first time they're holding instruments. So I sent that to a musicologist who pointed out that Willie was holding the banjo in the clawhammer style, and what can we learn from that? Because that was a style that was very common in rural Virginia where they were from. So maybe they learned maybe they already knew how to play music. One thing that was unquestionable is they were amazing musicians. The first time they were handed instruments, it was thought to be a joke, like a prop for a picture. And it turned out they were wonderful musicians, and they played multiple instruments. And there were lots of accounts of them playing instruments later in their careers.
So they couldn't read and they couldn't write, but they were amazing musicians naturally. How interesting is that? And we're having some technical difficulty, but Beth's going to be back. So this is a great story. So regardless of the sound, don't go anywhere.
Okay.
They are.
Yeah.
What I just said was that, even though they couldn't read and they couldn't write, they were amazing musicians.
Yeah, apparently they could hear a song one time and play it, by ear. And Nancy even said that Willie could recreate a song by snapping his fingers, like he could make different notes out of his fingers. And until the very end of his life, he held on to music. So this is like at the end of the book, he's still thinking about his mother rescuing them under a sideshow tent, and them singing that song, "It's a Long Way to Tipperary." And I have a photograph in the book of the guitar that he played up until he had a stroke at the age of 102. He still played a guitar, and he played it so much that the fretboards were worn down. And even after he had the stroke, he would still sing, and he would hold the guitar. So music was a really important thing in their lives because it gave them some agency. I mean, it feels good to do something and be good at, right?
Sure.
So, and they were no different. And so once they were able to have this secondary skill that they could perform for people under the sideshow tent, in addition to just being looked at because of the slightly different skin tone that they had, then, they were happier. They were happier because we're all happier when we get to do what we're good at.
Sure. And it's hard, even though, here they're getting there's clapping, there's joy around what they did. People are enjoying it, so it's hard. Listen, I just want to remind everybody to please call in if you have a comment, a question, something you'd like to know that I'm not asking. Call in 919-518-9773 or computers, that's plural, 2K voice. So Chris wants to know on our chat, how did this book, what did you learn about yourself during this book? How did you change?
Oh, such a good question. Well, it was parts of it were, I mean, I remember just being really sad and also I remember not being sure if I was going to be able to find out enough information to tell a whole story to bring this whole book to life. And I guess I learned just about the power of perseverance, I had a deadline. I had so much time I could spend on each chapter before I had to move on to the next. And sometimes I would just have to pronounce things unknowable. I would look and look and look for a fact and would find some things out, and other things I would have to just pronounce not knowable within the time frame that I have. And I was still able to, patch together a pretty interesting narrative about what life was like. And as I said earlier, when I couldn't find out exactly what was going on with them, I could find out what was happening with their family or somebody close to them or another similar kind of act in the sideshow, and somehow bring that world to life in a way that would illuminate what was happening with them, if not be exactly what was happening with them at the time. A friend had said early on, he said, don't be discouraged. Like, think about the Sebastian Junger book, The Perfect Storm. Like, we don't know exactly what happened to that boat other than it capsized and there were no survivors, and because there were no survivors, so we don't really know what happened. So get as close to it as you can. If you can't get exactly their account of it, get the next best thing. And so that's what I did. And I guess just the power of perseverance, and also how you treat people is really important. So the first time I waltzed into Nancy Saunders, the great nieces, she ran this little soul food restaurant in Roanoke, Virginia, called the Goody Shop. And she was their caregiver, and she was the stories gatekeeper. And she was the one that said, you're not going to get to interview him. She pointed to a sign that a customer had made for her, and she had hanging on the wall. And the sign said, sit down and shut up. She was like, Willie is not available for comment now, and he never will be. He's resting. And so, so she said, no, I couldn't do the story. But what could I do? I asked eventually if I could do a story on her restaurant. She didn't really want me even to do that, but her mom said, oh, Nancy, be nice, and cut me some slack. And so I did the story on her restaurant. Well, that still didn't really convince her to let me do a story on her uncles. But then I just started hanging out there because I liked it, and I wanted to get to know her as a person and as a person in the community. And that ended up being a place I would just sort of hang out and get other story ideas. And so that when he did pass away, she let me do the story. And then after the story, I liked her. I treated her. I always tell young reporters, I mean, to be a good journalist, just like be a person first, like be a human, like see people for who they are, not just for a story you're going to get. I never thought I'd be writing a book about them. But I was just hanging out at the restaurant because I liked her, and she's just a character and a half. And so when I, years later, it turns out I do want to write another book, and somebody suggests I turn that story into a book. Meanwhile, she's been reading me and judging me for a period of 20 some years at that point. And she knew me because, I had been spending the time to get to know her as a person. And I think that's another lesson, just be a person first and treat people the way you'd want to be treated.
And that's the way people open up to people, is when,
Yeah.
I mean, you're writing, and I love so many things that you've just said. So I want to go back to a few of the things that you just said, because I think that they bear repeating, expanding, and shining a light on it. So being this person, being the person that somebody wants to talk to, when you're doing what Beth is doing, and many of you out there might be wanting to write a book. This is one of the things that I would love to talk, to Beth about as well, is, when you're writing a book, if you're writing fiction, that's one thing. If you're writing nonfiction or historical, like what Beth is doing, your integrity and your gift of listening and hearing, you know, the story and what you said about getting close as you can,
Mm-hmm.
to the truth is
Mm-hmm.
so important. And you
Mm-hmm.
got to get, and people have to like you to want to tell you whatever it is, the
Es-
pieces that you don't
Especially a
hear.
white person. If you're a
Yeah.
black person and your family has been mistreated by the media for a century, and not just Nancy and the Muse brothers, but if you read the book, you know that I got in deep with the families from Truevine who had done sharecropping for numbers of years. And it took multiple visits before they felt comfortable enough to tell me about the brutal working conditions that they grew up in. There's that one exchange where the woman's saying, she doesn't want to tell me how bad it was, but this is the fourth time I've been out to visit her, and she knows I really want to know. And she says, don't take this the wrong way because I like you, but white people were hateful. And then she goes to explain that statement, and I understand. And her mother says they would feed us outdoors, they would hand us the food through the window. And she would have never told me that story the first time I met her. In fact, the first time I met her, I was doing another story and she didn't want to give me her name. And I just kept going back to her because I really liked what she had to say and I felt she was really honest. And I just kept going back. Probably borderline harassment, but not really.
Right.
And now we're tight.
Mhm.
And I don't think she regrets being in the book. I think she's proud of being in the book. I think she was initially nervous, like, is white America ready to hear these stories? But guess what? The book is out, and she's gotten nothing but praise for being brave enough to tell
Yeah,
what
I
her
was going to
family
ask
had
you.
been through.
Yeah, I mean, when you're the shareholder, the protector of the most intimate pieces of somebody's life that they don't want to even relive. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm sure on some level, some of these things they don't even want to tell, and maybe
yeah,
had never told anybody really outside of the people that already knew.
right. And for no fault of their own, like even the family was kind of ashamed of the story because I mean, you go back to
Hmm.
Nancy, who's this tough soul food restaurateur who her first memory is after the brothers who were her uncles retired. She grew up in the house that they owned in Roanoke, Virginia, and people would be banging on their door in the middle of the night demanding to see the savages that eat raw meat or wanting them to come out and play a song on the porch and making fun of her at school, saying which one's Eco and which one's Zyko, and she would stomp her foot and she'd say they're Mr. Willie Muse, Mr. George Muse, and that's why she's so tough. That's why somebody wrote her the sign on the wall, sit down and shut up, because she's really tough. But like, she's tough and she's funny and she's sweet if you spend the time to get to know her. But why is she tough? Like, that's what I wanted to get to. Why do people still believe that? I mean, to a person, the old African Americans that I interviewed for the story didn't think people would believe what they had gone through because it was so much more complicated than separate schools and separate water fountains. It was these daily indignities, and they never knew when it was going to strike. Remember
Right.
the story about the little girls walking to school
Right.
and having to walk past the white block, and there was an old lady who kept a pair of trained parrots on the side porch that had been trained to squawk racial epithets as the children as they walked by to school. And, an 86-year-old woman was recounting that story to me as I'm driving her around the neighborhood where Harriet Muse lived. And So I think there's still a lot of hurt that, and there's a lot of stories that need to be aired.
Mm. So, it's like the Holocaust, where people believe that people are not sure it really even happened.
Right. Right.
And there's
Some
so
people.
many, and there, the people who lived it. I mean, there aren't that many left. So
Right. And for years they didn't want to talk about it either because it was
no,
so painful. And it was the same with slavery. Um, there's an anecdote in the book about when they first at Colonial Williamsburg, the very first time they had an exhibit at all about slavery. It was before Roots came out. Roots sort of made it okay to talk about slavery and history. But when they first had the exhibit on slavery at Colonial Williamsburg, the exhibit was routinely sabotaged by the black maintenance staff because it was still too soon.
right,
It was still too raw.
hmm
And so
right,
I think it's really important for all of us, black and white, to know these stories and to know what people went through. And even younger African Americans who didn't go through Jim Crow, they still growing up in these families where they hear these stories, and where the legacy of Jim Crow still exists in some
yes.
fashion or another, even if it's just in the stories.
Oh
But
wait, Beth, hold on. We're going to reconnect with you. Hold on, just another second. All right, Amnon's going to reconnect, but you know what? Here you go. Call us 919-518-9773 or computers, that's plural, 2K voice. Please call in if you have any questions for Beth about the book or her writing process or anything that she has done. So tell us about what it's like to be a best-selling author for the New York Times. Like, what is that really like?
oh, I don't know. I'm just me. I still do the same things I do before. I mean, I'm still a reporter. I still go out and find stories. I have an idea. I go out and I try to find people to bring my ideas to life. And I just spend a lot more time on them now that I'm just writing books and not writing newspaper articles where, I'd be lucky if I get to spend a week on a story. Now I spend a year or 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the exact same skill. And I always tell young reporters, you're only as good as the facts that you've been able to amass. I mean, good writing is important, clear writing is important, but I always write best when I've got a lot of information to choose from. And so a lot of that is just, it's like old-fashioned shoe leather reporting. It's getting people to know you and to trust you, and to believe that you want to tell their story accurately and with dignity and respect. Um, it's the exact same it's always been, although now I get more time to spend on the stories, and then I spend a lot of time going out and talking about the books now, which I didn't do that before very much at all. So that's been really fun. I'm nearing the end of a book tour that's taken me from New York to Washington. I've just been to 2 book festivals in Florida, North Carolina, a lot of Virginia stops, and back to Virginia this week after I'm in Ohio now, and then I'll be in Colorado next week. And so that's kind of fun, getting to meet with readers all over the country instead of just in my little postage stamp area that I'm from. So it's pretty cool to get to hear other people's feedback from far away on the story.
So when you're the writer that you are, do you have several projects going on at one time? Can you do that?
Well, back when I was at the newspaper, I certainly did. I mean, I had to. Right now, I am under contract for a 3rd book, so I still occasionally go out and talk about Factory Man, which was my first book, and of course, Factory Man is super relevant today after given the debate and the campaigns and the election, and the outsized role that trade played in that. So Factory Man is a true story about a 3rd-generation furniture maker who, in Galax, Virginia, who basically sued China, the People's Republic of China, in a court of international trade from a tiny town better known for bluegrass and barbecue. So I'm still out kind of talking about that book. At the same time, I'm spending more time talking about Truevine. And then I'm reporting on for my next book, which is about the opioid and heroin epidemic at the same time.
And
So that it's kind of tough. I'm like kind of juggling a lot.
yeah. But the third book. So is there
Yeah.
a central or several central characters?
Yeah, there's several central characters, and I haven't determined exactly which. I'm kind of casting my net wide, and I want to write about. I mean, just to say broadly, since I haven't decided who I'm going to actually focus on yet, but it'll be mostly a Virginia story. Although I'm doing some reporting later today. As soon as we hang up, I'm going to Marysville, Ohio, which has had some problems with the heroin epidemic. But I'll be writing about the nexus between prescription pills, painkillers, and heroin. And I'll be writing about pharmaceuticals and diversion, and trying to get at this. It's the worst drug epidemic in history, and why has that happened? And what can we do about it? I'm trying to figure out the best way into that story, but I haven't quite landed upon the perfect story. There is no perfect story. There's so unfortunately so many stories to choose from, and also just the controversy over the best way to treat it is a big issue too.
Right.
So I'm trying to figure all that out.
I actually have. I'm a business and life coach, and now I'm an author as well. But I work.
Fantastic.
Well, yes, and part of my practice, I'm in a psychiatrist practice, and they focus a great deal on addiction. And I have recently sat in on some amazing talks about how doctors are getting fooled and how smart people are
Addicts
getting.
are.
Yes, just where they can go to get, just the right thing to take that urine test or all these.
Right.
I mean,
there's so many horror stories about, addicts getting their little siblings to pee in a cup so they can pass a screen for a job or for a drug test. Or one young man I'm following took a job as a moving company that helps older folks move out of their homes into retirement communities so that he could pilfer their drugs.
Yes.
So,
yes, I've heard that. And they're not taking their meds.
There's almost no family in America that hasn't felt a part of this story or doesn't know someone now. It's really pretty shocking.
It is. And what a timely thing for you to be. I mean, that is going to be one. I know that you're a phenomenal author. And that is going to be an amazing, timely book because, the older, senior, golden agers they need money. And they're selling their drugs.
Oh yeah, especially in I sometimes I think of this book as Factory Man Part 2 because it's in these areas where you'll notice an overlap between communities, rural, suburban communities where the job losses have been the hardest is also the places where the opioid epidemic is the strongest. So and also food insecurity and unemployment and underemployment and things of that nature.
Right.
So we'll be going back to revisit some of those communities I wrote about in Factory Man, which all grew out of the question of what happened to all those people that lost their jobs when their jobs were sent overseas.
So when you, like this book that's coming up, what was the impetus for that book?
Good question. Yeah. So I started reporting on that for the newspaper in 2012. And Roanoke at the time didn't really know it had a heroin problem. Of course it did. It just hadn't made the news yet. And there had long been a heroin problem with poorer African-American communities. But around 2005, 2006, it started to pop up in the white middle-class communities, and people were shocked. I remember there were a couple of weathermen, meteorologists on television who got caught with drugs, with heroin, and everybody was like, holy crap, no one knew that heroin was basically in the suburbs and wealthier people were doing heroin. So I did a series in 2012 about these two families whose lives were upended by heroin. One, I followed a young man who was getting ready to go to prison for his role in selling heroin to a classmate who died. And so I followed the two families, the two mothers mainly, as they were struggling with how heroin had upended their lives. And then I've stayed in touch with them, much like I did with Nancy after this story, not knowing I was going to do a book at the time. And one of the mothers, the mother of the son who died, actually asked me to write this book and she had played a role in getting some legislation changed in Virginia, wherein if young people or people of any age are doing drugs and someone overdoses, it's called a 911 Good Samaritan law. They can not be held accountable for calling 911. Like, the more important thing is to save a life rather than worry about if you're going to get arrested for possession. Right. And so she helped shepherd that law through, and she really wanted the story to be told in her son's honor. I also want to write about the issue of mass incarceration, because I think that's kind of a more subtle sub-theme, that so many people who are getting out of prison can't find work to support their families, to pay their outstanding court fines, their outstanding child support. And so they just go back to doing what they did before, which is dealing drugs. And this heroin thing, I mean, if we don't deal with the supply chain too, I think that's a kind of an untalked about point in the debate.
Well, yay for you. I mean, seriously.
Crazy me, yeah.
Well, yay for you, because, I'm not, some of these things you don't just know about. And we go day to day, process by process, job by job, family by family, all the things that we do day to day. And we don't, some things we just don't pay a lot of close attention to until it's right there.
Right.
So,
and unfortunately, I mean, I'm interviewing a police chief later today who has it in his own family. Mm-hmm. And that's why his officers now carry Narcan, because if they come upon somebody who's overdosing, they can, put the thing up their nose that revives them. Yep. And you see and you hear about it in more and more families. I was at a family wedding this past August in upstate New York, and a friend of the family was saying she heard about what I was doing, and she said, Beth, my 34-year-old daughter is a heroin addict, and I don't know what she had just found out. Young woman has 2 kids, and she said, Beth, what can your book do for me? How can your book help me help my daughter with a heroin addiction? And I had to say, I've since sent her some resources and some articles, but that question keeps me up at night. What can my book do about this? Mm-hmm. And so I'm struggling to figure out the best way.
Well, this was not even my intention, but if you down the road want to talk to the doctor that I work with, he's quite incredible. And he's really, he's a sports psychiatrist and specializes in addiction. And he's really smart. And he speaks all over the place. He's been on my show twice. We've spoken about addiction and we've spoken about families. And
what's his name?
His name is Dr. Eric Morse.
Okay.
He owns
M-O-R-S-E.
M-O-R-S-E. He owns methadone clinics.
Okay.
But he also has a heart.
Yeah.
And he's
probably been dealing with opioid addiction for
many
years if he owns a methadone clinic.
Oh, yes.
And he probably has an opinion about Suboxone.
My God, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. A lot of them use that in our office. Mm-hmm. And there's some other things that some of them use. And we have all these people coming to talk to us. And, I would really...
Oh, I would love to be put in touch with him.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll connect you with him.
And if any of your readers or viewers would like to get in touch with me, my website is authorbethmacy.com, AUTHORBETHMACY.com, and you can get in touch with me that way. Mm. I also have a Facebook page, Beth Macy Author, that I'll get your message that way as well.
Yeah, and this is a perfect time for bodacious marketing, advertising, sharing your book. So anything you want to say. Yeah. And she's on Twitter. Tell them about your Twitter.
I'm on Twitter, Paper Girl Macy on Twitter. Paper Girl, Papergirlmacy. I was the first paper girl in my little hometown. I delivered the newspapers. I was the first girl. And then I worked in newspapers for years, so that's why that silly moniker, but it works. And my book is available on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, in your independent bookstore. I love to support independent bookstores. And it's available anyway that you can buy a book. It'll be out there. It's by Little Brown, and it was published in October, and it just was named one of the New York Times 100 notable books of the year. That was a great honor, and it's showed up on some best of the year other lists, like Amazon chose it one of its best books of the year. So I'm grateful for that, and I think it's an important story, and I love to see this incredible woman, this incredible mother getting the attention that she never got.
Right.
100 years after the fact. I love to see that.
Well, it's a great honoring, and I don't know, I don't really believe it's ever too late, because we all get to learn from history. So history does not repeat itself, and that we can make a difference and honor these phenomenal contributors to our lives. So, yeah, it's fabulous. And so find her on Twitter. If you have any questions about Beth and you want to reach out to me, please do so at MarilynShannon.com. Any words of wisdom, Beth, as we close today?
No, I just think if you've got a story you want to tell, maybe it's your story, maybe it's a story these aren't stories I ever thought would turn into a book. They were, I was a paid newspaper reporter, and but these are stories that played on my heart for decades. And I think if there's stories that you really want to tell, they are going to eventually be told, and that you should just keep on making those connections and doing what you love. I think when our passion and what we're good at combines, that is the special sauce of getting to do this work that we love. And these stories need to be told.
Yeah, my book is being formatted, and my title is "In Just One Afternoon: Listening to the Hearts of Men." That's my first one, and it's a series. And the next one I'm already starting is "In Just One Afternoon: Listening to the Hearts of Twins." And then
wow!
In just
Do you have twins?
I'm a daughter of a twin.
Oh, okay.
So the first book, I've interviewed 20 some odd men from all over, experiencing, growth, emotional growth, whatever it is, creativity, experiencing lives and how they've gone about it. And then the same thing with the twins is, how the relationship between twins. And then I'm doing millennials, and I'm going on from there. I mean, I have a whole bunch laid out. But the interesting thing is, and piggybacking what Beth said, is when the editor got my manuscript, she said, my stories were great. They were raw and they were interesting and, grammatically, whatever. And I thought to myself, I can always be fixed. Grammar, my sentence structure, because I'm not, grammatically, I'm not the best. I'm a good talker, but I mean, as far as the writing part, needs work. As long as the stories that we're telling, have a heart and soul and mind, listening to the, so
that's always the most important thing. Right?
Yeah.
You're listening with the holy curiosity. You're just fully listening to someone.
Right.
And trying to get at their truth. I mean, those are going to be the best stories.
Absolutely. And so I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And
thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, Marilyn.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to, to hear you, to experience this with you, because as, when any of us listen to you and talking about this, we're part of the story. I could feel it. I'm part of the history. I can actually see the brothers, and it's just fascinating. So I want to thank you so much for being a great storyteller.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thank you.
Best of luck with your program and with your books.
Thank you. And I'll connect you to Dr. Morse.
Oh, thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah, my pleasure. And for everyone out there, I appreciate so much you being here with us today. I look forward to having you with us again next week. If you have any questions, if you have any story ideas, please share them with me at marilynshannon.com. It's always a pleasure, and thanks for being here, and we love you. So take care. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you next week. Bye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.